First thing, underline individual freedom. Known for her, I want to circle that, bobbed haircut. This is a very, very short haircut. A lot of the times before this time period, women had very long hair. They sometimes put it up in, buns and stuff, especially when they were working in factories for safety, but they never had short cut hair. Well, a flapper, because of her crusade for individual and equal rights, because the fact that she wanted to kind of shun the cult of domesticity, remember? Cult of domestic home. She wanted to shun that. She wanted to get rid of it. She said, I'm my own woman. I want my own style. She does things a lot different. Out beside this slide, you need to make sure you write makeup. You need to make sure you remember cigarettes, sometimes even drinking. These women were not wanting to go be the regular mom that is in the kitchen 12 hours a day. They don't want to do that. They want their own life. They're going to be one of the first types of women that go down in history as basically independent women. Now, the role of women. This is going to be one you want to pause again. Get the stuff down. Then it says the role of women is going to change dramatically in 1920. I know we've already kind of talked about it, but the 19th Amendment is passed. Remember, 19 is when women are granted suffrage. What does suffrage mean? You're right if you said it's the right to vote. The League of Women Voters is actually going to be created, and actually there's going to be something called the National Women's Party, founded by a woman named Alice Paul. This is Alice Paul right here in this picture. Now, my movie lunches, they're coming up. This is actually my favorite movie almost of all time. It's in the running with Forrest Gump. But Alice Paul is going to be one of the biggest influences in American history for women's suffrage. In fact, without her, I don't know if we'd have the 19th Amendment when we had it. But massively important. She actually split off from an older group called NASA. Long story short, it was a kind of a more conservative suffrage group. And Alice Paul was tired of waiting. They were campaigning for suffrage before the Civil War. The Civil War broke out. They had to take a back seat to the war. Then African American males got the right to vote, but they didn't. They are now pissed. They are very mad, and they come out swinging, and Alice Paul is one of the biggest ones. So you need to make sure you remember her name. So highlight her, star her, whatever you need. But 19th Amendment, Alice Paul, suffrage. Now, the other name you need to make sure you star on this is a woman named Margaret Sanger, called for limiting the number of children per family. Make sure you know who Margaret Sanger is. Basically, you want to take a kind of a short note out beside her name. She called for birth control. Capital letters, birth control. Now, this is a massively touchy subject, especially with religious reasons, and sometimes, guys, I know that I'm just talking to 17-year-olds. Birth control is something that was not used before this time, hadn't even been really come up with at that point. And so women were basically there, and if they had sex, they got pregnant. Now women have the right to choose if they want to get pregnant or not when they take birth control. Instead of taking and having 6 kids, she could have her own career, live on her own, and be an independent woman, otherwise known as a, well, what did we just call her? Last slide, a flapper. Good job. Called for limiting the number of kids. This is birth control. Margaret Sanger goes down in history as one of the first women to say, hey, women should have the right to choose. Kind of a hot topic, but it's building on women's rights. Oh, here's another good question. Pause it, see if you can know the answer. Might come up in a quiz. Who knows? Now, changes in literature and art. Now, here's something else. Kind of switch from the women's rights to kind of a little bit of a, if you will, literature aspect. Now, what you're looking at right here, it's called the Lost Generation. I need you to circle that right there. In fact, I think Mrs. Triplehorn's going to be having you guys read a couple things about the Lost Generation. This is a group of artists in the 1920s, and I want you to make sure you underline. Disillusioned with American, literally, society. They criticized the middle class materialism and conformity. Remember, just recently I told you in this notes that something called consumerism was coming up, that people were buying whatever they wanted. They were paying for it on credit, and everybody was buying the same thing. The Lost Generation said, y'all are looking all the same, you're doing all the same. It's stupid. You should shun society. You should not just do what everybody else does, and you shouldn't just judge what you are based on what you have. Kind of a very, very mature way of looking at it, but they wrote things like, ooh, here's something that you're going to be reading with Mrs. Triplehorn. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Star it. This is essentially the most amazing book of all. It is unbelievably great. I don't know if you guys have read it yet, so I'm not going to give away the end, but there's this guy named Gatsby, and I know y'all probably have seen the more modern one with Leonardo DiCaprio. Very nice watch, ladies. But it's this guy that he looks like he has this perfect life, and he's partying, and he has great times, and he's got like a woman for every night of the week, which is probably not sanitary. But still, he's having this fantastic time, and then in the end, you find out that his life is pretty much nothing like you thought it was, and it has a completely different ending, and that's basically the 1920s. Everybody wants to party after World War I. They want to have a great time. They want to buy, but they bought on credit. Then they went into debt, and then all of a sudden this great happen in time turns into the Great Depression. You want a parallel between literature and what actually happened? The Great Gatsby's it. Now the other one is Sinclair Lewis, an author who wrote about the absurdities of small town life. I always think about that show, The Gilmore Girls. Ernest Hemingway, a very famous author, pretty important. Make sure you star that. Eugene Neal, it was a modern playwright, kind of comes out in that. Literally, The Lost Generation is about literature and art in the 1920s and how things don't always seem the way they are. And literally, they criticize society because of materialism and conformity. That's what I'd highlight. All right, next thing I want to talk about, America Takes Flight. Ooh, yeah. Guess what's not in our standards to learn? The Wright brothers. But you should definitely write it out beside this slide because I don't want to kind of forget the Wright brothers. And of course, they are credited with the very first kind of flight in American history. But actually, who you need to know is a guy named, write the Wright brothers. Oh, I couldn't hardly say that. The Wright brothers out beside this slide. But here's what I need you to make sure you stop. You write down this slide and you circle this guy's name. Glenn Curtiss, American aviation pioneer, founder, underline this, of the U.S. aircraft industry. So the Wright brothers may have flown the first plane, but Glenn Curtiss is the reason we have an airline industry, not just a couple flights. His company built aircraft for the U.S. Army and Navy during the years leading up to World War I, and literally because of his advancements, you see here, literally Time Magazine weekly, on the cover of Time Magazine, Glenn Curtiss is going to basically make air flight possible for millions and millions of people. And one of those people is going to be this guy. Star this slide. Massively important. Charles Lindbergh became a symbol of American ingenuity and America's desire for success because Charles Lindbergh, here's what you circle, first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. And he flies on, and I like you guys to know this, his plane's called the Spirit of St. Louis. And Charles Lindbergh becomes like one of the symbols for American ingenuity and success and the idea that you can achieve whatever you want to achieve in the 1920s. Again, in the 1920s, it's all about the war's over, do what you want. And there had been this contest on who could fly solo across the Atlantic. And Charles Lindbergh becomes the first man to ever fly solo across the Atlantic. In fact, when I went to Washington, D.C. to see my brother honored this last year, he actually, his trophy that my brother's name is on, is right across the Air and Space Smithsonian, like literally right across the hallway from the actual plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. And I actually took a picture of it. Like literally where I'm standing, I could turn around and see my brother's trophy. It's really freaking cool. I'm so proud of my brother. But this is what I want you to show you, the Spirit of St. Louis. And I just want you to know that literally that right there, you can barely fit into it. I don't even know if I could fit into it. Like maybe an itty-bitty, skinny, teeny, itty-bitty person, like 16-year-old skinny girl could fit into it. But guys, that is one of the smallest things you have ever seen in your life. He flew across the ocean in it. So make sure you know, Charles Lindbergh, first person ever, to fly across the Atlantic. Going to be a pretty big deal. Charles Lindbergh is going to be known for a long time. Now, one thing I need to go with now is changes in literature and art. We need to start looking at, if we just looked at women, we need to make sure we look at African Americans. Remember, know your minorities because they are oftentimes going to be tested over, especially on the EOC. So here's one thing that I really want you to make sure you know, the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance. Take a second, get this slide down, circle Harlem Renaissance. Then I want you to underline African American culture, literature, theater, music from Harlem, New York. Here's the guy's name you need to start, Langston Hughes. We're actually going to be reading some of his work in class. And I'm going to expect you to know who he is because you're going to be listening to these notes and getting these notes down. Now with this, African Americans, Harlem, New York, remember from World War I, we had the Harlem Hellfighters. Anytime you see that word Harlem, in fact, out beside this slide, I want you to write this, Harlem equals African American. Harlem equals African American. Harlem Hellfighters, Harlem Renaissance, well, I guess kind of Harlem Globetrotters. I know you guys might not know who they are, but they are a pretty good basketball team. A lot of them African American. With that, Langston Hughes, this whole cultural change, we have the Lost Generation as well, but they're more about disillusion with society. The Harlem Renaissance is more about African American society. And remember, during World War I, we had the Great Migration. Great Migration. Remember, what does it mean to move? They moved from the, where? South to the north during World War I, because what had become available in the north? Factory jobs, because a lot of men had been drafted or selective service. So they went to the north in hopes of less racial discrimination, no Jim Crow laws, and better treatment. And when they went to the north, up in New York, there's this little place called Harlem. And Harlem is going to be the epicenter for African American culture in the 1920s. Now, in the beginning of the Jazz Age in New York City, there was a very large acceptance of African American culture, African American literature, African American music. I've got just some pictures right here of some of the artwork of the 1920s. It kind of shows you what it was like in Harlem, kind of depicts this party lifestyle. And remember, it's all about the party in the 1920s, but this is specifically looking at the Harlem African American aspect to it. Now with that, oh, I love this picture. And here's the deal. You have to take this with a grain of salt, but it's history, so that's why it makes it awesome. What is the absolute funniest name you could literally name an African American club? The Cotton Club. That is the hottest club in Harlem, New York. It's so freaking awesome. They embraced their humor, their ancestry, unfortunately, and they came up with the name the Cotton Club. Some of the best jazz musicians of all time would literally play at what we call the Cotton Club. And guys, here's the other thing, and I know that sounds awesome that they are awful that they named it the Cotton Club, but you got to think about this. That was the place to be. For whites, for blacks to play in the Cotton Club was the pivotal experience for a musician. So that means that being African American no longer is shunned, is looked down upon in the North, but sometimes it is now the cool thing to do. Jazz became what was coming out of everybody's radio. So I think that's actually an achievement for African Americans. You have here a jazz singer, all this kind of stuff like that. This is, there was this woman named Bessie Smith. She was really, really amazing. Here's a name you're going to know, Louis Armstrong. Make sure you write that out beside this slide. Oh, never mind. I'm sorry. It's on the slide. Jazz Age, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, the Cotton Club. Here you have right here. Here's a little practice question on the Harlem Renaissance. 1920s expanded influence of African Americans by. Did you get an answer? It was 4. So pretty amazing there. Now, still talking about music, let's go ahead and get down Tin Pan Alley. Pause this slide, get it down. Tin Pan Alley, literally a number of music publishers in New York City, District of Manhattan. Tin Pan Alley is oriented towards, I need you to make sure you underline or circle producing songs of amateur singers. Small town bands could perform that printed music. This is actually, and out beside this slide, right, EOC. This is one of the things the EOC kind of threw at us. And actually, I'm going to be real honest with you guys. Before, I have 2 degrees in history, did not know what Tin Pan Alley was. So you might want to make sure you know this one for the EOC. They stuck it in there, and I kind of had to look it up. It's this district in New York, Manhattan, and it is where literally they take, and they started the idea that, everybody can play music, not just the musicians of the day. So they took like Louis Armstrong, they took some of the big musics of the 1920s, and they made it into sheet music. And I know I have a lot of you guys that are big in music and band that want careers in music. Tin Pan Alley is the very first place that we started to see sheet music publishers that publish popular music. This is kind of showing Tin Pan Alley. If you go to New York today, you can literally, this is a present day look of Tin Pan Alley. This is what it used to look like in the 1920s. But this is the first place we start seeing mass music produced. Now,